For joining us for the May edition of Coffee with Coker. As always, it's a privilege to have you join us. Immediately following today's presentation, we'll have a question and answer period, so please feel free to submit your questions in the area provided in the GoToMeeting dashboard. The participant phone line will be muted for today's presentation, and the materials will be emailed to you shortly after the conclusion of this session. As you exit the webinar, a brief survey will pop up, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on this presentation as well as suggestions for future topics. Joe Lewis, Senior Manager, and Stefan Werdiger, Vice President at Coker Group, will be leading today's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Jill and Stefan.
Thank you, Savannah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to spend an hour with our Coffee with Coker series as we talk about physician leadership. Stefan and I will take about 45 minutes to present the material, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes or so for questions. Today we are talking about developing physicians as leaders, why we need them, why leadership can be challenging for them, and how we can help create effective leadership programs that provide the best platform for physicians to learn. To give you an overview of today's presentation, I'm going to talk about why we need leaders in the first place, why leaders are so important to our success. I'll talk briefly about changes in the healthcare industry, specifically how the Affordable Care Act increased the need for physician leaders and why their leadership is critical in managing those changes. I'll explain how a physician's clinical training creates unique challenges in leadership and the skills needed to be effective in a leadership role. I will outline a couple of different pathways you can take in creating a leadership development program, and I'll offer some recommendations. And lastly, Stefan will discuss the important things to consider when recruiting physician leaders. And then, again, we'll leave the last 15 minutes for you to ask any questions you may have. So why do we need leaders? As part of our evolution as human beings, we evolved to find food, to seek shelter, to stay alive. We formed groups because our very survival depended on it. We chose leaders who exhibited strength and stamina and confidence because they prevented chaos within the tribe and they kept us safe from danger. Perceived danger in today's modern world hasn't really changed all that much. We just face danger from different things, but we still maintain the group mentality as a way to survive. Organizational change is one such perceived danger for many people, and we look to our leaders to develop and communicate the strategies that will guide us through that change. Today, we still embrace a hierarchical structure for safety and hopefully to thrive. While we may not worry about being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or where to find food, we still perceive the world around us as threatening. And as we look for safety, in our jobs and protection from our leaders. Effective leaders go first and they eat last. They navigate change and they give us direction. This is what's considered the social contract of leadership. We expect leaders to put themselves at risk to look after us, to sacrifice themselves for our protection. Leaders who don't accept and respect this contract often doom themselves and their organization to failure, whether large or small. Simon Sinek is one of my favorite authors and public speakers. If you're interested in this topic, the social contract of leadership, you can click on the YouTube link at the bottom of this slide, which is a link to his talk entitled Why Leaders Eat Last. It was given about 2 years ago to 99U, which is an association for creative professionals. And if you like this talk and you want to see more, he also has several TED Talks. One of them is in the list of the top 10 most watched TED Talks. So I think you'll like him and what he has to say. Let's talk briefly about the changing landscape of healthcare. As you all know, healthcare spending, both private and government, increases each year consistently. As of the end of 2015, healthcare spending accounted for 17% of our gross domestic product. As you also probably know, partly in an effort to mitigate these unsustainable cost increases, the Affordable Care Act was passed. It is a complex and ambiguous legislation, and I offer no opinion about its efficacy or its appropriateness. It's a hotly debated topic, as you know, and is a webinar all by itself. It's probably several webinars. I mention it, though, because it is through the lens of the Affordable Care Act that this presentation will view the need for physician leadership. I think healthcare has needed physician leaders far longer than the lifetime of this legislation, but it certainly drives us to discuss physician leadership development more today than perhaps previously. I won't take up much of your time talking about the details of these three programs. I assume you've all either read numerous articles or have sat through your fair share of presentations on the subject. I included this information primarily to indicate the specific areas of change that must include physicians as leaders. As you can see, each one deals with quality, outcomes, or other clinical care redesign and delivery. I'll talk on the next slide why physicians must lead these efforts, but the main point here is that they must be brought to the table for healthcare institutions to successfully implement any of these programs. Because physicians are the drivers of patient care, they are in many ways the only people who can lead the changes needed to meet these new requirements. They are not small, insignificant changes, but are changes that affect the entire organization. And not only do physicians need to be involved, but the entire clinical team as well. The Affordable Care Act programs require teamwork, and leading teams and navigating change require specific leadership skills that must be intentionally developed. Some of these include the ability to communicate a vision and inspire others to adopt it as their own, fostering collaboration between team members, empowering and trusting those members to act in accordance with the vision, and lastly, placing value and taking action that encourages learning and process improvement. There are as many definitions of leadership as there are people who write about it. If you do a search of leadership books on Amazon, you literally will get over 86,000 results. But in the academic world, at least, most researchers agree that leadership is a complex study, that it is a process of one individual influencing another toward achievement of a common goal. So, more succinctly stated, most people agree that leadership is an influential process occurring in groups in an effort to achieve a common goal or a set of goals. A physician's training, while obviously perfectly tailored to the practice of medicine, does not often transfer well to the practice of leadership. In fact, the two are nearly the exact opposite of each other, which creates a larger challenge for physicians assuming a leadership role than it is for most of us. Physicians are taught to be autonomous when caring for patients. Residency and fellowship programs are very competitive. Competition is encouraged. Independence is rewarded and becomes therefore ingrained. Quality is what the physician says it is. Physicians often detach from emotion in order to provide the best care for the patient. That's not to say that physicians are not empathetic. In fact, I've experienced great empathy from many physicians, both as a consultant and as a patient. And lastly, physicians tend to be deficit-based thinkers. In patient care scenarios, they are always looking for the problem. All of these aspects of clinical training, while good for patients, I think you can see how they don't translate well to leadership. As I mentioned in the last slide, leadership occurs in groups, so not independently. It requires influence and connection, so not emotional detachment. And leadership involves common goals, not individual standards. Leaders look for solutions, not problems. Effective leaders will recognize a problem, but are far more focused on the solution to that problem. So none of what I've discussed on this slide is meant to be critical. On the contrary, it's meant to provide an understanding of why physicians have bigger challenges than non-physicians when it comes to leading people, and why it's of vital importance that physicians are provided the opportunity to intentionally learn what it takes to be a good leader. Many people enter leadership positions without considering or learning about the specific skills needed to be successful in that position. Luckily, we have many great leaders who have gone first and have demonstrated what it takes. As a leader, you must be able to inspire your followers to adopt your vision as their own. This is always true, but especially true in the face of change. Just because you tell people how great change will be for them, if you can't inspire them to believe it, they may answer to your authority, but they will never truly follow you. We all know much of the work that gets done in our organization is done through the work of teams. As Jim Collins writes in his book, Good to Great, creating a powerful team, what he terms getting the wrong people off the bus and getting the right ones on it, is the first step in creating a team whose members will trust each other and collaborate to achieve great things. Embracing change by its very definition means looking beyond the way we've always done things. And facilitating relationships to encourage confidence and build competence has always been a key indicator of successful leaders. And finally, and this last point is easy to overlook, effective leaders recognize the contributions of others and they celebrate victories, large or small, in meaningful and often creative ways. They go beyond simply adding more dollars to a person's paycheck. There are several foundational leadership aspects that are not always known or considered. The first is to understand the contract of leadership. We expect our leaders to sacrifice themselves so that we will be safe, not the other way around. There are countless examples of leaders who have allowed their team to be sacrificed so that the leader might gain. One example that you're probably all familiar with is the Enron disaster. Among many egregious, unpleasant actions, the top executives told all the employees to continue buying Enron stock, that it was stable and that it was a good buy, that the company was stable. And all the while, those same executives were selling off their shares for millions of dollars in secret. So not only did all the Enron employees lose their job when Enron filed for bankruptcy, but many lost their entire life savings along with it. A second basis for effective leadership is to embrace self-awareness. Understand what makes you tick, your strengths, your weaknesses, your motives, and your fears. We bring all four to work with us every day, and they influence everything we do. Third, and this is important for anyone, become a lifelong learner. Being teachable is a common trait among great leaders. They understand that they don't know everything about leading people and organizations, and they remain open to new ideas and new way of doing things and thinking about things. But you have to set yourself up to be exposed to these new ways and these new ideas. Fourth, create a spirit of generosity within your team and within your organization. Be willing to help each other and demonstrate that you value generosity, a willingness to be of service to others. This creates a culture within an organization that, I promise you, will move mountains to carry out your vision. And lastly, as a leader, know who you serve. Many leaders are unclear about this and oftentimes are only serving their own ego. I'm sad to admit this, but I've been that leader before. Thankfully, it was many years ago, but I do understand that perspective and how easy it is to fall prey to it. This is not the same thing as servant leadership, which is a specific style of leadership, and some of you may be familiar with it. I could do a separate webinar on that style alone. My point is that leaders exist to serve their followers and their organizations, not themselves. Cognitive intelligence does not equal leadership competency. Very often, positions are recruited or promoted to leadership positions based on intelligence and clinical expertise without consideration for leadership ability. If you had a group of widget makers and you decided they needed a leader, a supervisor, for example, what would you likely do? Most people would take the best widget maker and make him or her the leader, except leadership is a completely different skill set than widget making. Clinical expertise versus leadership competency is no different. Not only have healthcare institutions historically not chosen physician leaders for their leadership ability, they've also not provided true leadership development to help physicians be successful in their new role. Creating a learning environment, designing a successful leadership program requires a few foundational aspects, much like those discussed on the previous slide entitled, "Where Should Any Leader Start?" First, a commitment from the physicians participating in a leadership program to be proactive in their own learning. Primarily, I mean not being passive, waiting for someone else to take action. An obvious way would be a commitment to read and study any of the massive amounts of leadership literature that is readily available. That's a very good place to start. An expectation of commitment from physicians must be met with an equal commitment on the part of your organization to offer leadership development in ways that meet the needs of the physician. There is no one-size-fits-all for leadership development. Leadership is about people, and we are all different. We have different needs, we have different perceptions, different skills. Committing to meeting the physician where they are is a far more solid course of action. Along those lines is a commitment to one-on-one coaching aimed at teaching the specific skills or developing the specific areas in need of improvement. I'll discuss the value of one-on-one coaching on just a few slides from now. Developing success measures speaks everyone's language. Those investing in leadership development, whether financially or with their time, need to be able to measure the results, and preferably quantitatively. A few areas of measure are patient satisfaction scores, productivity, and turnover rate. All three can be accurately measured and tied to an organization's success. Lastly, I strongly encourage engaging with someone who has the experience to develop and assist in implementing a leadership development program in your organization. Often, outsourcing provides someone without preconceived ideas about the organization, its positions, or any historical issues that may exist. It provides a fresh set of eyes and can often engender more trust with the physicians participating in the leadership development process. An outsider has no dog in the hunt, as they say. I'm going to discuss two types of programs that have historically been successful with other healthcare organizations. The Cleveland Clinic is one such institution, and I'm happy to provide a few articles written by one of their lead physicians about the success of their program. He's been very involved in researching and writing prolifically about physicians and leadership and some of the challenges that they face. So if you want to email me or Savannah or Stefan, we'll be happy to send you a few of those articles. Creating a classroom-style program has the benefit of addressing many physicians at one time and provides the participants peer support as they go through the program. Utilizing assigned reading material and case studies are valuable resources that teach real-world leadership concepts and give the physician an opportunity for individual as well as group learning. Keeping class size small, 10 to 20 physicians, allows for valuable class discussion, and it reduces the likelihood of someone hiding in the back and not participating. It also allows for team-based learning by creating in-class group assignments, and it lessens the need for lecture-style discussion. Use of a cohort-style group ensures that all participants have peer support and can provide accountability for each other. Assuming there are multiple courses within the leadership program, the same group of physicians can complete each course together. Avoid putting large groups of physicians together in lecture-based learning as a major component of your leadership program. There's a lot of academic research that suggests action learning is far more valuable for students to learn and apply the material once they've completed the course. I teach undergraduate management and ethics as well as graduate marketing at a university here in Austin, Austin, Texas. And my students are far more engaged during class exercises and group projects than if I make them listen to a lecture. There's no better sleep aid than sitting through a lecture, but maybe that's just for the 20-something crowd, or it could be the 8 a.m. class time. I'm not sure, probably both. The second type of leadership development program is one-on-one coaching. The value is that it addresses leadership competencies an individual physician lacks, but it does so in a confidential environment. I don't know anyone who likes having their deficiencies revealed for all to see, and physicians are certainly no exception. It also helps target directly those areas in need of improvement. Oftentimes in a group setting, the person who most needs to hear about how to improve in certain areas is not aware that the presenter means them. Not only do we not like others to see our deficient areas, but we often don't see or don't like to see them in ourselves. If you decide to go this route, and I strongly encourage your consideration of this type of program, hiring someone with the credentials, the assessment tools, and in particular experience working with physicians will give you the best results and build trust with participating physicians and those who might want to participate later. Encouraging independent study becomes more of a focus in a one-on-one environment, but also allows for a deeper discussion of certain relevant topics than a group setting might allow for. The use of validated personal assessment tools as well as 360-degree evaluations provide a level of self-awareness as well as how the physician leader is perceived by others. Areas in need of targeted improvement are always identified this way, something not necessarily gained in a classroom setting. And finally, allowing several physicians to participate simultaneously in one-on-one type development allows for the peer-to-peer support that I've discussed on a couple of other slides. Now that we've discussed why we need leaders, and in this case, physician leaders, what makes those leaders effective, why leadership can be particularly challenging for physicians, and two different types of leadership development programs, you may be wondering, where should I start? Some healthcare executive teams we've worked with tend to try to color using broad strokes. In other words, they try to deliver leadership education to all their physicians at one time or try to develop big programs before understanding what is actually needed and what will be the most successful. If you've never implemented any type of leadership program, I suggest you start small. Pick 1 or 2 positions or a small group of department chairs. 10 to 20 is still a reasonably sized group. This allows you to tweak the program as needed and as it goes along, and it'll help you develop something solid that will work more for the long term. Utilize both types of programs discussed today, the classroom style and the one-on-one. I recommend, regardless of the number of physicians, whether you're just starting this process or you've done it before, the use of both group and individual type development, because they provide a balance between individual learning and application of more universal concepts. Implementing both programs allows also for some variety in the learning process, and physicians can support each other as they learn. They can discuss the challenges that clinical training brings to their leadership development process. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Stefan, who will talk briefly about recruitment, specifically considerations for recruiting physician leaders. Stefan?
Thank you, Jill. Appreciate it. And I wanted just to touch on the other spectrum of what ties into what Jill said in terms of recruiting physician leaders. We do a lot of work at Coker Group with helping organizations recruit physician leaders, and we've seen some trends and some things that I think would be helpful to share, all of which tie into what Jill mentioned. And first and foremost, you can develop leadership programs, and certainly there are times when there may be a need when the person in that role may not be the right fit for that physician leader and maybe better suited in a different role, and that role opens up for a variety of reasons, or just vacancy, or physician leaves, or whatever. There may not be strength internally on the bench, and you need to go out and recruit other physician leaders, or you are doing a clinically integrated network and you need more leadership to fill roles. So I just want to touch on some things to think about. First of all, the market as we see it, there are extremely tight requirements from everything from hospital organizations to physician groups. The needs that they want those physician leaders to do are, high bar. They want, A+ players, and they expect a lot out of them. And so in the recruitment process, it does narrow the candidate pool because there are not a lot of those folks with that type of background, and it can make it more difficult. So think about that as you create job descriptions for your physician leaders and giving some flexibility to that and the scope of the role, because that'll help you in your recruiting efforts. The leadership development is really the key thing that we see out there in terms of candidate slates, and that goes across not just physician leaders but other executive leadership roles. For example, CEOs of organizations are being tasked with being able to build relationships with physicians and understand how to develop physician leaders. Especially in clinical roles and in IT roles like chief medical information officers, we're seeing a big need for physician leadership in the candidate slate. The two roles that I just mentioned that we see a lot of out there are physician leadership roles that are now becoming CEOs of hospitals. If you look at some of the big players like Cleveland Clinic, there's a host of others that are beginning to put leaders in the CEO position who are physicians for a variety of reasons. Memorial Hermann just did that. If you've seen the news there, they just hired a physician. So that's becoming more and more prevalent, and so that's going back to what Jill talked about. You have to make sure you're hiring based on a solid leadership ability, not just skill set. And we also see a lot of administrative roles for physician leaders, as I mentioned, chief medical officers, chief medical information officers, chief of staff, and there's a lot of different needs out there. So think about that as you're looking at your requirements. We also feel, and I feel, that it's imperative that organizations are in agreement on the position, and especially for physician leaders because it's such a crucial role. And what I mean by that is when you go out to start your recruitment or look at the market, even if you're looking at internal candidates and you're looking at interviewing them, make sure that you're talking amongst your key stakeholders and have everybody together on the same page about what you're looking for, what the role is, what the background and leadership style and dynamics of the person that you're looking for are, what are the key requirements of the constituents and stakeholders. I think it's, in today's healthcare environment, it's a lot more than just sitting around the table with the C-suite and saying, gee, who do we want for a chief medical officer? I think it's more about reaching out to the clinicians, to the ancillary care, to the clinically integrated network team, and finding out from all of your stakeholders, what are they wanting, what are they looking for, what are the needs that they see, and making sure that everybody's in agreement, because if you recruit and try and do a search based on people that are not in agreement, your interview process is going to be very disjointed and it makes it very difficult. So I highly recommend that you pull the teams together first, almost acting like a consultant to understand what the needs of the organization are. Jill, you want to move to the next slide?
Well, I'm hitting page down, but...
Oh, technology is sometimes our worst nightmare. Thank you. No problem. A couple other just quick thoughts on recruiting. Again, you really need to recruit based on cultural fit and leadership style, not just on the CV. And many, many times I see organizations that recruit just on the resume, and a beautiful resume with academic, positions and research and all sorts of credentials, which is great. Nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't mean that that person's going to be, that position is going to be a good fit for the organization or your network or your ACO, because there's a lot of dynamics there, and you could put the wrong person in the wrong role. So while that's important, make sure that you're getting an understanding of what your culture is like. There are a lot of tools out there to help you do this. There are a lot of assessments, and also there's a lot of interviews that you need to do internally to get a gauge for what the different groups are. For example, the nursing organization clinical team may have a little bit different personality or different culture than, say, the C-suite or the long-term care group. If you're in a clinically integrated network, some of the physician groups that are employed versus those that are not may be very different in how they act and respond. So keep culture in mind as a very important piece of this, and really use that in your recruitment. And most importantly, I think, is you've got to interview them based on that culture as well, and find out their leadership style, and if that leadership style of that physician leader matches your culture. So there's a tendency for people in the interview process to just interview physicians based on their accomplishments, their resumes, all the things they've done, and that's great. But if their leadership style and how they deal with teams is not going to be effective for you, that could be a challenge. And if you remember back to what Jill said about the tendency or nature of how physicians grow up in their education, it's a competitive environment. They're always going to be trying to achieve first place, and that's great for treating people in medicine, but like she said, that may not fit the culture and how they lead teams and how they deal with conflict. And there's many occasions we've seen where a chief of staff, a chief medical officer, you name it, just isn't working out because they're not leading effectively and dealing with the team. So do keep that in mind. The other point, too, is that I think that it's important in today's market. As I said, it's a very different market than it was 10 years ago in healthcare. Finding A-plus players is a very limited, very limited quantity right now, and especially those that have the skill sets that organizations are looking for the new future of healthcare. It used to be that, gee, it was just within the walls of the hospital. We're just looking for a physician leader that can be your traditional CMO, and that there is no traditional role anymore, because you've got so much going on with value-based care process, population health. They've got to really be a jack of all trades. They've got to be able to deal with the network, the employed docs. They've got to be able to deal with alliances and affiliations and all the things going on, and mergers and acquisition work. So this requires requires a skill set that is very hard to find out there. And I think that means that the organization has to take on a more proactive approach in recruiting. Used to be that we would see organizations, several years ago, the recruitment department would just post ads and just kind of wait and see what comes, and then they get a few resumes. But those folks may or may not work out, those physician leaders or other leaders, and they're forced to go back to the drawing board. So I think in today's world, what I'm saying is it's much more proactive. I think the traditional ways of recruiting have changed, and you have to be much more relationship-based. You've got to reach out to the network. You've got to have, as a healthcare organization, a very tight network of influential people. You've got to have and train a recruitment team or HR team that's able to go out and understand how to get referrals from others and reach out proactively to people in the network, and really sell a position and not rely on just the passive side of marketing a position, because to get the kind of talent that's needed, I think it's going to require a much more proactive approach, as we've been seeing. And the last point I just wanted to make, and it ties into everything that Jill talked about, is that when you are bringing on a new physician that you hire, it's imperative, we believe it's imperative that you put some kind of a onboarding program together. And that onboarding program, as Jill mentioned, having 360 reviews, having peer one-on-one coaching, having a lot of dynamics of how you bring them on board is very, very important, because if you hire a physician leader and just sort of let them go and get, trial by fire, I think you're setting up the organization for, less success. But having a 90-day or 60 to 90-day window where you do an onboarding program with them will be really helpful, and I think it'll ensure that there's, more likelihood that that physician leader is going to be successful and fit into the organization. And I think by doing that, you can identify issues that pop up, challenges or gaps, and put a plan in place with that physician leader, with the CEO or whoever the leadership is, to address any issues coming up and iron them out before it becomes a big challenge. And I hope that that's helpful for you. I think those are some thoughts, and again, it all ties into Jill's comments on leadership development, which we are seeing such a high need for in the industry right now. And that's all I had, and we're going to move now, Jill, towards questions and talk a little bit further, let you ask anything you'd like.
Thank you, Stefan. I just want to leave everybody with this one last closing thought. I think regardless of your political leanings or thoughts about President Reagan, he was considered by many to be a great leader, and I think the great communicator was what he was known as. So this was just a nice quote of his, and I thought it tied well into our presentation today. So we are going to open up the Q&A session. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and I will read them out loud so that everyone on the presentation today hears them, and then depending on the question, Stefan or I will answer that for you.
Jill, I see one question that came in here, and maybe this one would maybe best for you to kind of to answer. But one of the questions was, how important is understanding culture in developing physician leadership? And I know something I was just mentioning before, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, culture is what supports everybody in the organization, all of the leaders and certainly all of their followers, and it demonstrates what that organization values and what conversely it doesn't value. Is it a supportive culture that values learning? Is it a culture that is based solely on productivity? Or, I mean, there are many different ways that culture comes into effect an organization, but in the end, it is the thing that demonstrates what the organization values. And so if you know that your organization values leadership development or increased learning, becoming a lifelong learner, that sort of thing, then you're far more likely and able, in fact, to pursue those things for yourself.
Great. A couple other questions that came in here. One question, I think this is a very good one actually, how do you make leadership development continuous? In other words, how do you make it ongoing and not just a one-time event that happens and you forget about it? Do you want to address that, Jill?
Sure. So definitely not, the annual physician staff meeting and, bring in somebody to talk about leadership and then you don't talk about it until the following year. And even if you develop a more formalized program and say that it's one that we've sort of talked about today where it's, it's partly classroom and maybe it lasts over a period of a few months on weekends or something, and there's one-on-one coaching. I think from there, there needs to be follow-up in terms of either allowing those leaders to attend other development seminars, if you will. Certainly the ongoing 360-degree evaluation process is very important because the typical evaluation is your boss assessing how they view you and the way that you do your job. And the 360-degree tool also asks the people who work for you how you're doing, and believe me, they will have a very different view just from their perspective. And so it continues to highlight those areas that we need to develop. And if we're, committed to that lifelong learning process, then there are always things for us to develop. So I think just an organization's commitment to doing that is important.
Great. Okay. And looks like we have one last question here. And again, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to type them in here. Someone asked about best practices for finding outside physician leaders in today's market, and I'm happy to answer that. I think that ties back to my comments earlier about the market dynamics and being proactive with recruitment. I think there are two key things I would recommend that are helpful in that space. I think one is to develop a recruitment plan. I think just like if you're going to market a product, you're going to have a plan. If you're going to run a business or a hospital, you're going to have a plan. So to recruit really requires a dynamic plan that you can have multiple different pieces of, both passive and active. So for example, you may post things, you may go out and reach out to conferences and people that were at conferences, but you also are going to have the active reach out to the network and people that are known to that organization or the leadership team, and use a dynamic blend of a lot of different things. That's one thing I would highly recommend. And two is that I would look for where there are groups of people that are similar to what you're looking for. For example, if you're looking for a specific kind of skill set and it's going to be focused on somebody who's been a physician leader in a clinically integrated network or in a ACO environment, there's a lot of that going on. You want to target where you look for those individuals based on other like organizations or other groups in the industry. You want to say, gee, should I reach out to, who's been doing clinically integrated networks, who's a thought leader in the industry, who's been out there that we should be reaching out to network with, and using them as an influential piece to network with and get contacts with people with those skill sets. So I hope that's helpful. There's a lot more you can do, but those are just a couple of quick ideas to help. I think, Jill, that's all the questions we had right now. And again, we will send the presentation out, but if anything else that Jill or I can help with, or you want to bounce any questions off of us offline, feel free to reach out anytime. Savannah, turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jill and Stefan, for that wonderful presentation. Again, like Stefan said, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to Jill or Stefan at the contact information provided. Again, we would appreciate your feedback on this presentation through the survey as you exit the webinar. The slides of this presentation will be emailed to you, and we thank you for joining us today.